The morning of December 23rd, 1944, Major Hans Weber stood in the frozen Belgian forest, staring at what should have been impossible. Before him stretched an American supply depot, hastily abandoned during the initial German breakthrough in the Ardennes. But it wasn't the depot's size that made his hands tremble inside his threadbare gloves. It was what filled it. Rows upon rows of Sherman tanks, lined up as casually as passenger cars in a peacetime lot, trucks by the hundreds, mountains of ammunition crates stacked higher than a two-story building, food supplies that could feed his entire regiment for months, just sitting there, left behind as if they were nothing, as if they could be replaced tomorrow. Weber had been an officer in the Wehrmacht since 1939. He had fought in Poland, France, and spent 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. He knew scarcity, he knew rationing, he knew what it meant to count every shell, to make every litre of fuel stretch just a little bit further. But this was something else entirely. One of his junior officers, Lieutenant Krauss, approached with a captured American manifest. His voice carried an edge that Weber couldn't quite place. Disbelief, perhaps, or fear disguised as wonder. Herr Major, according to these documents, this is a secondary supply point, not even a primary depot. Secondary. The numbers swam before his eyes. He read them again, certain he had misunderstood. He hadn't. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment, this crystallization of impossible reality, represented something far more devastating than any military defeat. It represented the shattering of a fundamental belief that had sustained the German war effort since 1939. The belief that German industrial might, German engineering excellence, and German organizational efficiency made them superior to their enemies. The belief that quality would triumph over quantity. The belief that they could not lose. But the numbers told a different story. A story that men like Major Weber were only beginning to understand in the winter of 1944. A story about industrial capacity so vast, so utterly beyond German comprehension, that it rendered meaningless every tactical victory, every brilliant maneuver, every sacrifice made by German soldiers in 5 years of war. To understand how this realization came about, and why it struck with such devastating psychological force, we must go back to the beginning, to the moment when Germany believed itself invincible. In the spring of 1939, Germany stood as Europe's industrial powerhouse. The Ruhr Valley churned out steel at rates that had made Germany the continent's manufacturing center since the late 19th century. The factories of Essen, Dortmund, and Düsseldorf operated with the precision that German engineering had become famous for worldwide. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he had immediately prioritized rearmament, pouring resources into military production that had been severely limited by the Treaty of Versailles. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Wehrmacht possessed approximately 3,000 tanks. This represented a massive build-up from the token force Germany had been allowed to maintain in the 1920s. More importantly, German tank production had been refined to an art. The Panzer III and Panzer IV represented some of the most sophisticated armoured vehicles in the world, products of careful engineering and rigorous testing. German industry didn't just build weapons, it crafted them. The propaganda machine reinforced this narrative constantly. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and propaganda produced newsreels showcasing German factories, German workers, and German technological supremacy. The message was clear and repeated until it became doctrine. German quality, German efficiency, German ingenuity could not be matched. One German tank was worth 5 enemy tanks. One German soldier, properly equipped with superior German weapons, could defeat 10 enemies with their inferior equipment. And for the first 2 years of the war, the evidence seemed to support this belief entirely. The Polish campaign lasted 5 weeks. France, the nation that had defeated Germany in the First World War, fell in 6 weeks during the spring of 1940. The Low Countries collapsed before them. By June 1940, German forces stood triumphant across Western Europe, having achieved in weeks what Imperial Germany had failed to accomplish in 4 years of grinding trench warfare. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, had worked exactly as planned. Superior German tactics, superior German equipment, and superior German organization had carried the day. Even the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, seemed to confirm German superiority. In the first 6 months, German forces advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks and aircraft, and captured millions of Soviet soldiers. The victories were so complete, so overwhelming, that Hitler himself declared in October 1941 that the Soviet Union had been struck down and would never rise again. German industrial production during this period reflected the confidence of a nation that believed it had already won. In 1940, Germany produced approximately 2,400 tanks. In 1941, production increased to 3,600 tanks. In 1942, it rose again to 4,300 tanks. These numbers seemed adequate, even impressive, for a nation that had conquered most of continental Europe. After all, the war was essentially won. It was just a matter of mopping up remaining resistance. But across the Atlantic Ocean, something was happening that German intelligence either failed to comprehend or simply refused to believe. Something that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of modern warfare. The United States had entered the war on December 8, 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. America had been providing material support to Britain since 1940, but direct involvement transformed everything. President Franklin Roosevelt understood something that the German High Command did not. Modern industrial warfare wasn't won by the best tank or the best soldier. It was won by the most tanks and the most soldiers, delivered to the battlefield faster than the enemy could destroy them. On December 29, 1941, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt delivered his Arsenal of Democracy speech to the American people. He outlined production targets that must have seemed fantastical to any European observer. He called for 60,000 aircraft in 1942 and 125,000 in 1943. He demanded 45,000 tanks in 1942 and 75,000 in 1943. He wanted 20,000 anti-aircraft guns, 35,000 in 1943, 6 million tons of merchant shipping in 1942, 10 million in 1943. German intelligence received reports of these targets. They dismissed them as propaganda, American boasting, impossible exaggeration designed to intimidate. After all, America had entered the First World War late, and while American troops had been brave enough, everyone knew it was French and British forces that had done the real fighting. America was a nation of gangsters and cowboys, good at making movies and consumer goods perhaps, but completely unprepared for the serious business of modern industrial warfare. The numbers would prove otherwise in ways that would shatter German certainty like crystals struck with a hammer. In 1942, while Germany produced 4,300 tanks, the United States produced 24,700 tanks. But this disparity was just the beginning. American production didn't plateau. It accelerated. In 1943, Germany managed to produce 5,700 tanks, a number achieved only by mobilizing every available resource, by converting civilian factories to military production, by working German laborers to exhaustion. The Germans considered this an impressive achievement, a demonstration of total war commitment. That same year, the United States produced 29,000 tanks, more than 5 times German production. And America was simultaneously fighting a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific, building thousands of aircraft, hundreds of ships, and supplying not just its own forces, but British, Soviet, and other Allied forces as well. But raw numbers alone don't capture the psychological impact of this disparity. To understand what Major Weber felt standing in that Belgian forest, we need to understand what these numbers meant in concrete, material terms that German soldiers experienced directly. German soldiers in late 1944 operated under conditions of severe scarcity. Fuel was rationed down to the last litre. Artillery shells were counted carefully, used only for essential targets. Food rations had been cut repeatedly. A typical German infantry ration by late 1944 consisted of approximately 300 grams of bread, 120 grams of meat, or meat substitute, a small portion of fat, and some vegetables when available. This amounted to roughly 2,800 calories per day, barely adequate for men engaged in combat operations in winter conditions. Replacement parts for vehicles were desperately scarce. Tank crews learned to cannibalize damaged vehicles to keep others running. If a Panther tank threw a track, the crew might wait days or weeks for a replacement, if one came at all. German mechanics became masters of improvisation, crafting repairs from whatever materials they could scavenge. The vaunted German Tiger tank, one of the most formidable armoured vehicles of the war, suffered from chronic mechanical problems that Germany simply lacked the resources to address. The Tiger's Maybach engine required constant maintenance. Its overlapping road wheel design, while providing excellent weight distribution, meant that if an inner wheel was damaged, crews had to remove multiple outer wheels to reach it. In the frozen conditions of winter, this could take hours, leaving the tank vulnerable and immobile. German tank crews learned to expect mechanical failures almost as much as enemy fire. American soldiers, by contrast, operated in a reality so different it might have been a different war entirely. A standard American K ration, issued to frontline troops, contained approximately 3,000 calories, but K rations were considered minimal. Whenever possible, American units received B rations or A rations, which included fresh meat, vegetables, bread, and desserts. American soldiers complained about their food, as soldiers always do, but they never went hungry. They never experienced the gnawing, weakening hunger that had become routine for German troops by 1944. American vehicles came with complete sets of spare parts. Maintenance manuals were detailed and widely distributed. If a Sherman tank broke down, replacement parts arrived within days, sometimes hours. If a vehicle was too damaged to repair quickly, it was often simply abandoned and replaced with a new one. The abundance was so absolute that it bordered on waste by German standards. German intelligence officers who interrogated American prisoners in 1943 and 1944 consistently reported findings that their superiors dismissed as exaggeration or lies. American POWs spoke casually about the vast supply systems supporting them. They described depots with thousands of vehicles, warehouses filled with ammunition, supply lines so robust that shortages were virtually unknown. German interrogators assumed these prisoners were either lying to boost morale or had been deceived by their own propaganda. But evidence kept accumulating, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots reported American convoy columns stretching for miles, not occasionally, but constantly. Every day, on every front, American supplies flowed in quantities that seemed impossible. German fighter pilots who survived encounters with American air formations reported facing hundreds of aircraft. Not dozens, hundreds. And when they shot some down, more appeared the next day, and the next, in numbers that never seemed to diminish. By 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany had brought the industrial disparity home in the most literal sense. American B-17 and B-24 bombers appeared over German cities in formations of hundreds of aircraft, escorted by long-range fighters that could reach any target in Germany. The 8th Air Force alone could dispatch 1,000 bombers in a single raid. The physical presence of this armada, darkening the sky, made abstract production statistics into concrete, terrifying reality. German fighter pilots fought desperately to stem this aerial tide. They developed tactics, used new aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter, and demonstrated extraordinary bravery. They shot down Allied bombers by the hundreds, but the bombers kept coming. For every B-17 shot down, 2 more appeared. The mathematics were inexorable and devastating. On the ground, German forces experienced this abundance most directly during the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Within days of the initial landing, Allied forces had established supply depots on the beaches that would have been considered major logistics centers in the German system. Within weeks, these had expanded to cities of supplies, with dedicated roads, railways, and even fuel pipelines. The Pluto pipeline under the ocean, pumped fuel directly from England to France. This single engineering project delivered more fuel than the entire German Afrika Korps had received during its entire North African campaign. German officers who learned of Pluto's existence struggled to comprehend how the Allies could devote such resources to a single logistics project. The Germans had brilliant engineers, but they lacked the industrial capacity to build something so ambitious while simultaneously maintaining their combat forces. After the breakout from Normandy, in late July 1944, advancing Allied forces captured German supply depots. American and British soldiers were shocked by what they found, or rather, by what they didn't find. German supplies were meager, carefully organized and rationed. German rations were bland and minimal. German fuel stocks were tiny compared to Allied standards. German ammunition supplies that the Wehrmacht considered adequate would have been considered dangerously low by Allied standards. But German forces who encountered abandoned Allied supply points experienced the opposite revelation. They found abundance beyond comprehension. Major Weber's experience in the Ardennes was repeated thousands of times across the front. German units advancing during the Battle of the Bulge specifically targeted American fuel depots, knowing their own supplies were inadequate for sustained operations. They needed to capture American fuel to keep their offensive moving. This dependence on capturing enemy supplies for a major offensive revealed the depth of German logistical desperation. When they reached these depots, German soldiers discovered stockpiles that exceeded their most optimistic projections. Fuel in quantities sufficient for weeks of operations. Food supplies were so abundant that German soldiers, half-starved after years of reduced rations, gorged themselves sick. Medical supplies in such variety and quantity that German medical officers wept. One German doctor, captured after the Ardennes offensive, told his American interrogators that he found more morphine in a single captured American aid station than his entire division had been issued in the previous 6 months. The psychological impact of this disparity cannot be overstated. German soldiers had believed absolutely, that they were fighting for a nation with superior industrial power, that German organization and efficiency made them unbeatable, that the sacrifices they endured, the privations they suffered, were temporary necessities that would lead to ultimate victory. But the evidence of American 5 abundance destroyed these beliefs completely. If America could afford to leave supplies like this behind, could afford to abandon equipment because moving it was more trouble than replacing it, could afford to feed its soldiers 3 hot meals a day and still have surplus, then what chance did Germany have? What had all the sacrifice been for? Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, experienced this realization in the most direct way possible during the Normandy campaign. His division, considered one of the best-equipped German units in the West, was systematically destroyed by Allied air power and artillery over the course of several weeks. After the war, Bayerlein described what it felt like to face American material superiority. The feeling of powerlessness against enemy aircraft and the abundance of American artillery ammunition was crushing. We would establish a position, and within hours, American artillery would reduce it to rubble. We would move, and American fighter bombers would find us. We destroyed American tanks, and the next day there would be more. We could not win. We could only die slowly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics that Major Weber saw on that captured manifest in December 1944 told a story that German leadership had refused to accept until it was far too late to matter. By the end of 1944, the United States had produced over 88,000 tanks since entering the war. Germany, over the same period, had produced approximately 23,000 tanks. This nearly 4-to-1 advantage was actually worse than it appeared. because German production figures included tank destroyers and assault guns, not just tanks. Pure tank production showed an even greater disparity, but tanks were only part of the equation. The United States produced over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced just over 119,000. The United States built 2,700 Liberty ships and hundreds of naval vessels. Germany's surface navy was virtually extinct by 1944, with most resources devoted to U-boats that were increasingly ineffective against improved Allied countermeasures. Perhaps most devastating was the disparity in motor vehicles. Modern warfare required trucks to move supplies, troops, and equipment. The Wehrmacht entered the war with significant motorization, but German truck production during the war totaled approximately 346,000 vehicles. The United States produced nearly 2.5 million trucks. This 10-to-1 advantage in motorization meant that American and British forces could move supplies and troops at speeds German commanders could only dream of. German forces increasingly relied on horses for transportation. By 1944, the Wehrmacht used over 2.5 million horses. The German army was partially mechanized and partially medieval, fighting an enemy fully motorized and fully modern. The human cost of this industrial disparity was staggering. German soldiers fought brilliantly with inadequate equipment, insufficient supplies, and no hope of victory. They held positions that should have been overrun, conducted counterattacks with depleted forces, and demonstrated tactical excellence that won battles but couldn't win the war. Because wars are not won by tactics alone. They are won by logistics, by production, by the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. German tank ace Kurt Knispel, credited with over 160 tank kills, destroyed more enemy tanks than any other tank commander in history. His skill was extraordinary, his bravery unquestioned. But for every tank he destroyed, American factories produced 10 more. His excellence was strategically meaningless against such overwhelming material superiority. By late 1944, some German commanders understood the hopelessness of their situation. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, before his forced suicide in October 1944, had advocated for ending the war through negotiation. He had seen the writing on the wall during his time commanding German forces against the Allies in North Africa, Italy, and France. He knew that courage and skill could not overcome such massive material disadvantage. But Hitler refused to acknowledge reality. The Nazi leadership continued to promise wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, new U-boat designs. These weapons were indeed technically advanced, often superior to Allied equivalents, but they came in dozens or hundreds, while American weapons came in thousands or tens of thousands. A jet fighter that shot down 5 bombers was impressive, until 20 more bombers appeared. A V-2 rocket that destroyed a city block was terrifying until you considered that Allied strategic bombing could destroy entire cities. The ideological implications of this industrial disparity were equally devastating for German true believers. Nazi ideology had preached racial superiority, Aryan excellence, the triumph of will over material circumstances. But there was material evidence that contradicted everything they had been taught. America, that mongrel nation of immigrants and different races, that democracy of shopkeepers and capitalists, had outproduced the Aryan master race by factors of 4, 5, or 10 to 1, depending on the metric. How could this be reconciled with Nazi racial theory? It couldn't. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable for those who truly believed. Some retreated into denial, insisting the numbers were propaganda, that final victory remained possible. Others broke psychologically, their entire worldview shattered. For the average German soldier, the realization was more practical but no less devastating. They had believed that their sacrifices served a purpose, that Germany could win, that their suffering would lead to victory. Learning the truth, that they had been fighting a lost cause for years, that their leaders had either been deceived or had deliberately lied to them, destroyed morale in ways that battlefield defeats never could. Wehrmacht desertion rates, negligible during the early war years, climbed dramatically in 1944 and 1945. Entire units surrendered when given the opportunity, particularly on the Western Front. German soldiers who had fought fanatically in Russia or North Africa gave up readily when facing American forces, not because American soldiers were more formidable fighters, but because German soldiers understood that American abundance made resistance futile. The contrast between fronts was stark and revealing. German soldiers on the Eastern Front continued fighting with desperate ferocity even as the Red Army advanced into Germany itself. They feared Soviet revenge, and they had reason to. But they also hadn't experienced American material superiority in the same direct way. Russian equipment was often crude, supplies were adequate but not abundant, and the Red Army won through mass and endurance rather than overwhelming logistical superiority. But German soldiers who surrendered to American forces discovered that even captivity reflected this industrial disparity. American POW camps, while certainly not pleasant, provided regular meals, medical care, and relatively humane treatment. German POWs gained weight in American captivity. They received proper medical attention for injuries and illnesses that would have been ignored or inadequately treated in German military hospitals by late war. Some German prisoners, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, ate better as American POWs than they had as civilians in Depression-era Germany. The psychological impact of this went beyond simple gratitude for decent treatment. It reinforced the fundamental lesson that German soldiers had learned in combat. America possessed resources beyond German comprehension. They could afford to feed their enemies properly. They could afford to provide medical care to prisoners. They could afford everything, apparently, because their industrial capacity made such abundance routine rather than exceptional. Major Hans Weber, the officer we met at the beginning of this story, survived the war. He was captured by American forces in January 1945 when his unit's fuel ran out during the retreat from the Ardennes. In post-war interviews, Weber spoke about that moment in the Belgian forest, looking at the abandoned American supplies. He described it as the instant he knew Germany had lost the war, not just the battle, but the entire war. Everything after that moment was simply playing out the inevitable. Conclusion. Weber spent the remaining months of the war in a POW camp in France. He worked briefly in an American supply depot, helping to organize the vast quantities of material flowing to Allied forces for the final push into Germany. He described watching American trucks arrive in endless convoys, unloading supplies that were then loaded onto trains, then onto other trucks, in a logistics system so vast and complex that it boggled his mind. He had been a professional officer, trained in logistics among other military arts, but what he witnessed was beyond anything German military theory had prepared him for. The numbers themselves are almost incomprehensible. The United States produced approximately 2/3 of all Allied military equipment during the war. American factories turned out 47% of total global arms production. In 1944 alone, the peak year of American war production, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, 49,000 artillery pieces, and over 643,000 machine guns. To put this in human terms, imagine a factory that produces one completed B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The Ford Willow Run plant achieved this production rate in 1944. One complete heavy bomber every hour from a single factory. Germany's entire aircraft production from all factories combined never exceeded 40,000 aircraft in any single year. Or consider the Liberty ship program. American shipyards launched 18 Liberty ships per day at peak production. These were not small vessels. Each Liberty ship displaced 14,000 tons and could carry 9,000 tons of cargo. The United States built over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. Germany managed to build fewer than 1,000 U-boats over the same period, despite U-boats being smaller and theoretically simpler to produce. The Sherman tank, often criticized by modern historians for being inferior to German tanks like the Panther or Tiger, was produced in quantities that made its technical limitations largely irrelevant. Yes, a Panther had a better gun and thicker armor than a Sherman, but for every Panther Germany produced, America produced 10 Shermans. And Sherman production was so rapid that American tank crews could abandon damaged tanks that German crews would have spent days trying to repair. German tank ace Otto Carius, another highly skilled tank commander who survived the war, wrote in his memoirs about the frustration of destroying multiple enemy tanks only to face more the next day. He described the experience as trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. No matter how many enemy tanks they destroyed, more always appeared. The mathematics of attrition worked against Germany absolutely. This industrial disparity extended to every aspect of war production. The United States produced over 41 billion rounds of small arms, ammunition during the war. Germany produced approximately 13 billion rounds. American soldiers could afford to fire freely, knowing resupply was abundant. German soldiers learned to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, because they never knew when more would arrive. The disparity in artillery ammunition was even more pronounced. American artillery doctrine emphasized massive preparatory bombardments before any attack. German positions would be subjected to hours of sustained shelling, with thousands of rounds expended to soften defenses. German artillery, by contrast, was carefully rationed. German artillery officers had to justify every barrage, account for every shell. By late war, German artillery often remained silent during battles simply because they lacked ammunition. This affected tactics directly. American infantry could call for artillery support routinely, knowing it would be available. German infantry learned to fight without artillery support because it often wasn't available when needed. The psychological security that comes from knowing you can call in massive fire support cannot be quantified, but it was a significant advantage for American soldiers and a devastating absence for German soldiers. The legacy of this industrial disparity extends far beyond World War II. The lesson that modern wars are won by logistics and production rather than just battlefield prowess became fundamental to American military doctrine. The United States military has maintained overwhelming logistical superiority ever since, understanding that the ability to supply forces in the field, to maintain equipment, to replace losses, determines victory more than tactical brilliance. For Germany, the lesson was different and more bitter. Post-war German military theory absorbed the understanding that technological excellence means nothing without adequate production capacity. Quality matters, but quantity has a quality all its own, as Stalin supposedly observed. German engineering excellence had produced superior individual weapons in many categories, but superior weapons in inadequate quantities lose to adequate weapons in superior quantities. The human tragedy underlying these statistics is that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers died fighting for a cause that was already lost by the time they entered service. Young men conscripted in 1943 or 1944 fought bravely, died courageously, for a nation that lacked the industrial capacity to achieve victory, regardless of how well its soldiers fought. Their sacrifice was rendered meaningless by decisions made in Detroit and Pittsburgh, in shipyards and aircraft factories, in places they would never see by workers they would never know. Major Weber returned to Germany in 1947. His homeland was destroyed, occupied, and divided. The industrial cities of the Ruhr that had been Germany's pride were rubble, but reconstruction began remarkably, quickly, aided by American money through the Marshall Plan. That same industrial capacity that had crushed Germany militarily now helped rebuild it. Weber found work as a civilian logistics manager, applying his military training to peacetime reconstruction. He never spoke much about the war, but colleagues reported that he kept a photograph on his desk. It showed rows of Sherman tanks at an American supply depot in Belgium. He never explained why he kept it. The Battle of Production, as it came to be known among historians, was decided before most of the famous battles were ever fought. By the time German forces realized the true scale of American industrial might, it was far too late to respond effectively. Germany could not quadruple its production. It lacked the raw materials, the factory space, the skilled workers, and most critically, the time. American production ramped up in 1942 and 43, when Germany was still confident of victory. By the time Germany recognized the threat, American factories were already producing at levels Germany could never match. This is perhaps the war's greatest irony. Germany lost World War II not primarily on the battlefield but in the factory, not through superior Allied tactics but through superior Allied production. The decisive weapon wasn't the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber or any specific piece of military equipment. The decisive weapon was the American industrial system itself, capable of producing war materials in quantities that turned warfare into a mathematical certainty rather than a contest of skill and courage. German soldiers like Major Weber learned this lesson in the most painful way possible. Standing in frozen forests, staring at supplies their nation could never have abandoned because their nation never possessed such abundance in the first place. The psychological trauma of this realization, of understanding that everything they had fought for was futile, that their nation had committed them to a war it could not win, haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The numbers themselves became a form of weapon. When German prisoners learned the true production figures, when they understood that America had built 50,000 tanks while Germany built 6,000, the knowledge destroyed whatever fighting spirit remained. What was the point of escaping to return to combat when combat could not change the outcome? What was the point of resistance when resistance was mathematically futile? This was the true horror that German forces discovered in 1944 and 1945. Not just that they were losing, armies lost battles and wars throughout history, but that they had never had a chance. That, from the moment America entered the war, the outcome was predetermined by industrial capacity. That all the bravery, all the skill, all the sacrifice had been meaningless, because the mathematics made victory impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.